Things just seem to be getting really wild in the PC hardware and gaming space right now. But hey, when we started having these conversations, I did say that this was going to get much worse and spill over into other segments of the industry and other markets. And we're seeing that with handhelds, the console market getting hit with shortages, Western Digital basically reporting that they've sold out of all hard drive inventory for the remainder of the year. And what, we're only 2 months in right now, a month and a half, and HP rolling out a lease program for their laptops because hey, instead of making people pay, hundreds or thousands up front, let's just ease them into a smaller monthly payment plan, except you don't actually own the hardware at the end of it. So all of that and more to be discussed in this video. Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel, and I hope you're all doing well. Today we've got a number of topics, but they're all basically related to the same underlying problem, which is the DRAM, memory, and storage supply crisis, which has been totally getting out of hand due to the AI and tech giant enterprises, which are just gobbling up all of the supply. And while we've already seen the impacts of this on the consumer side with DDR5 and DDR4 memory kits, SSDs, and even GPUs starting to see some drastic price increases, there are other impacts and segments that are now starting to feel the pain, and it just can't be ignored as people really start to look for alternatives, because, for many people right now, building a desktop is now out of reach or seen as a very luxurious item. They're looking for other solutions because the traditional ones, the traditional methods, they're just not viable anymore. But when other segments are getting impacted, then what are you left with? And look, I get that people are tired of hearing AI as the explanation for everything and would rather point to things like, corporate greed or late stage capitalism, but all of these things are driven further and are exacerbated by AI. Because when the supply chain gets warped that badly enough, the outcome isn't just, higher prices. It changes what products exist, how often they're available, and eventually how companies want you to pay for them. So I wanted to start off with something that kind of threw me back, which was Western Digital's CEO coming out and saying that their HDD production capacity for all of 2026 is sold out, and we're only like, a month and a half into this year, like in middle of February, and yeah, he's just flat out saying that it's gone. Not, hey, prices are going up or, things are getting harder to find, but the literal production capacity is all tapped out, and most of it is going to their top 7 customers who are, the big tech giant corporations like Microsoft, who has had a pretty big role to play in this whole AI craze, but that's more of a topic for a different video. And we also have companies like HP who are, gobbling up all of the demand for all of these parts. And it's really affecting the consumer supply chain as well. And we're going to be talking about HP a little bit later on in this video. Now, if you're a PC gamer, you're probably thinking, who the hell cares? And I guess the same could even be said for console gamers at this stage as well, because a lot of people are primarily using SSDs for storage of their games. And look, I can understand where you're coming from. I personally can't even remember the last time I actually loaded or booted a game off of a hard drive. I think since like 2019, I had primarily switched to using SSDs because as they were getting cheaper, it just made sense. And I've basically had all of my games installed on them. I think my personal rig has like 5 terabytes of NVMe storage on it. My OLED rig has 4 terabytes. Heck, even my MSI Claw handheld, I upgraded that device to a 2 terabyte NVMe drive. However, hard drives still definitely have a place in the consumer market, especially if you're someone who dabbles into stuff like content creation, right? 4K and even 8K video files, they can get really large in file sizes for sure. And if you're someone who streams and you stream for multiple hours on days on end, you definitely want a lot of storage. Or you're just, not even into the content creation space, but you're someone who wants to build their own media library and to be able to use things like Plex or stuff like Jellyfin. Hard drives are a cheap, or at least, they used to be a cheap, but an alternative if you're looking for mass storage as opposed to blazing fast loading times or read speeds. But that also means they are an integral part of the data center and their operations, considering how much information and data they have to handle and store. And with the recent announcements, Western Digital themselves are basically admitting where their priorities are now. It's basically what we saw happen with Crucial. Cloud business makes up a overwhelmingly majority of their revenue and portfolio, and the consumer side, it's really just a tiny slice at this point. And that's not, some moral statement. It's just the nature of the business as to what happens when enterprise customers show up with gigantic volume commitments and long-term agreements, and they don't care about how much costs have increased. And here's where things really start connecting to your life. Once that enterprise machine decides it needs capacity, it doesn't wait for the next sale. It doesn't care about what your Newegg card has. It cares about locking down supply, period. So the question becomes, if storage is getting booked out like this, and memory was already a mess, what happens to everything that's dependent on memory and storage being cheap and abundant? What happens to phones, laptops, handhelds, TVs, pre-built computers? What happens to all of that stuff? Is, things that were supposed to be produced at predictable prices. It's just a big question mark at this point. Which brings us into the second story, because it basically says the quiet part out loud. PC Gamer covered reported comments attributed to Phison CEO, and the messaging is pretty brutal. This was sourced from a Chinese account on Twitter who had an exclusive interview with the CEO. He's warning that many consumer electronic manufacturers could go bankrupt or exit product lines by the end of 2026 because they just can't source enough memory. And because the market is shifting so hard into what is called a seller's market, that it's doing things that are basically unheard of in the consumer electronics side of the business. Now, I do feel like the CEO's comments, they may have been stretching it a bit, but even with that caveat, the details line up with what we've been watching since late 2025. DRAM and NAND have been prioritized for AI, pricing is going to remain elevated, and supply is being treated like a strategic resource instead of like, a commodity part. And the part that's almost comical until you realize it's real is the claim that upstream suppliers are demanding 3 years of prepayment to secure supply, stuff that we hadn't really seen until recently. They've been giving brutal examples as well. Smartphone production potentially down by hundreds of millions of units. PC and TV productions is getting cut hard. Low-end storage like eMMC flash, like that 8GB cheapo stuff, going from what used to be cheap and now considered absurdly priced and still going to be hard to buy. And, that's the part that really changes the whole tone of this conversation, because when cheaper storage is going to start to get like nuked like this, it really raises the floor with it. Budget then becomes mid-range, mid-range becomes the previous generation flagship, and then the flagship is going to start breaking new barriers or settling at price ranges that we hadn't seen before. And you take a look at stuff like, Halo products like the RTX 5090, which is going for like $4,000, $5,000 plus, right? It's insane for a consumer or what some people consider a gaming graphics card. And, a lot of insiders and company executives aren't even saying that this is where AI has peaked. They're actually positioning this as this is only the beginning, especially on the inference part. The argument is that the training gets all the headlines, sure, but inference is going to get scaled much wider. It spreads everywhere and becomes this endless storage and memory hunger machine. And it's not just for SSDs that are attached to the GPUs. Like, you take a look at like NVIDIA's Rubin that he was talking about, which demands a whopping 20 terabyte SSD capacity for each of the chips. It's just insane what they're demanding. But for everything that comes afterwards, like caching and long-term data storage, the squeeze is going to get worse regardless of if you even buy into their projections or not. Now, here's the nuance that matters. Phison isn't only coming out and saying that the market is doomed. They're also pushing their own answer to it. They're basically giving this idea or putting this idea out there that if DRAM is getting way too expensive and is getting really hard to secure, then instead of building PCs that need like, 256 or 128 gigabytes of RAM just to run the AI stuff locally, you could use smaller amounts of DRAM and then offload that workload into specialized flash storage with software optimization. Or like we previously discussed, maybe you can just buy your compute off the grid. So yeah, it is a warning, but it's also kind of like a sales pitch in a way, if you know how to read in between the lines there. And they're basically saying that, yeah, the shortage is real, the crunch is going to get much harder, but by the way, we actually do have a solution maybe in the works that can make this less painful. But this also then leads me into our next topic and how this is actually affecting some of the gamer hardware side, right? Aside from DIY components. And this pertains to Valve and their Steam Decks and their upcoming Steam machine. And the handheld market has been growing a lot these past few years, and I've certainly gotten interested into it a lot. I've, primarily have found myself gaming on the MSI cloud these days. And they're devices that are getting a lot of traction because, like I said, people, if they can't buy desktop towers or fallen laptops, then it's another alternative method that they're looking into. Maybe I can get a handheld as a substitute for a while, but now even those are facing problems, unfortunately. So Valve actually updated the Steam Deck page, the product page, with a note saying that Steam Deck OLEDs may be out of stock intermittently in some regions due to the memory and stock shortages. That's not speculation. That's Valve openly acknowledging that the same memory and storage crunch that's been messing with pricing is now messing with their ability to keep a mainstream consumer device consistently available. And while Valve isn't, mass producing consumer electronics on the same scale that a company like Apple or Samsung does, they're still a notable company with real demand and, real scalability. And when they start putting warnings on, product pages, it really tells you that this isn't a tiny bump. It's the kind of supply constraint that forces companies to communicate differently, plan differently, and sometimes make uncomfortable choices about what versions of products can even survive. And along with that, I'm sure you guys were all aware of other plans that Valve had for upcoming hardware, like the Steam Machine, something that I know other tech tubers were very, very much interested in. And I was interested in it as well. Still am, kind of, right? It all just comes down to the pricing. And this was supposed to be that gateway of a streamlined device to bridge a lot of the console gamer market and non-tech enthusiasts towards PC gaming. And while the messaging from Valve right now is that they're committed to releasing the device this year, they've also admitted that the environment is just so volatile right now that pricing and timelines are just really hard to lock in confidently. So that's the part that should make you uneasy about all of this, because it's the opposite of what the consumer electronics market really relies on. Consumer electronics are supposed to be predictable, mass producible, iterate yearly, and then, have lower costs over time. But in this case, that is not what's happening here. And heck, it's not even just Valve. There's larger companies in this space that have also been increasing prices on their handhelds, like Lenovo with the Legion Go and Xbox with their ROG Ally. We've seen a price increase on them as well. And, adding on to that, there's been reports that it's not just RAM and SSDs or the individualized components that are causing a strain on consumer electronics, but the cost for common raw materials is now also going up, like tin and copper. And copper, as you can imagine, is just used in so many different components, from PCBs on your motherboards and the GPUs, from the heat sinks and AIOs, which keep those GPUs and CPUs cool. And, that's just another major ingredient you have to factor in terms of the production of the devices. And now manufacturers will have no choice but to raise prices, and obviously they're going to be pushing those extra costs onto consumers. I saw this tweet on Twitter, and it was pretty eye-opening, because it basically just shows you how much the DIY market has been impacted over the last 4 or 5 months. The sales of CPUs from Amazon US have dropped by nearly 60%. While CPU prices haven't really increased as much as to the extent that RAM and GPUs have, they're pointless to buy if you can't attain those other parts for cheap, and then that prevents you from building a rig or completing your rig. And what was actually interesting to see was that older, quote-unquote, obsolete CPUs like the 5800X based on Zen 3 and even the 3600 based on Zen 2 saw an increase in sales year over year, because some people have thought that, okay, since DDR5 prices are sky high, forget about the newer platforms, I'll just settle for a, cheaper AM4 alternative. DDR4 prices have surely been climbing as well, but not to the same extent as DDR5. So I'll get one of those kits and just bide my time with that. But, manufacturers, they are getting pretty creative with the responses when it comes to people being deterred by these higher upfront costs. And HP has launched an Omen gaming laptop subscription that, depending on the tier, runs from about $49.99 per month to $129.99 per month, with the top tier including an RTX 5080 laptop GPU. And there is a trial period too, but after that, you're basically actually locked into a 12-month commitment. It's basically, a contract. And more importantly, you never own the laptop, which is just hilarious. So you pay all this money, and then at the end, you just keep paying, but it's still not yours. Now, I'm not going to do the lazy thing here and pretend there's zero audience for this. There are certainly people who don't want a huge upfront cost, right? And there are a lot of people who want predictable monthly expenses. There's, students and parents or short-term use cases, whatever, I get it. However, I was looking at what it costs in terms of the long term, and I don't think it's really worth it to go for these kinds of machines at these pricing models. And it's kind of interesting to see the upsell tactics as well, because if you compare the two middle models that we see here, for $10 more, you can get double the RAM and then upgrade to a whole new GPU tier. Like that's that's trapment that they lay out over there. And I think it's a no-brainer, but funnily enough, it's the lower priced one that's out of stock at the time of making this video. But I was looking at the top tier model, which goes for $129.99 with the RTX 5080 mobile GPU, and it's important to mention that it's the mobile variant. It's nothing like the desktop one, which is kind of deceptive. It's certainly a deceptive practice from NVIDIA, if you ask me, because it's only comparable to like a desktop class RTX 5060, and that can vary too depending on power and thermal limits and what kind of profiles the manufacturer has set up on the laptop, right? And over the course of the 12 months, this laptop will end up costing you over $1,500, not including regional taxes, by the way. And in that case, I just recommend building like a cheap AM4 system that, a lot of people, I guess, seem to be doing now with the 5060 class desktop GPU. Because it's the fact that you basically paid the price of a full-on desktop, but then don't even own the hardware at the end. That's the part that really, I think, stings the most. But the timing of this is what's certainly interesting. These rental and subscription models don't just suddenly pop up because companies woke up and decided, we're going to be generous. This shows up because the market is just so hostile enough and volatile that people are starting to accept the access or the leasing model as a substitute for ownership. And when hardware costs are climbing and availability starts to get really weird like this, people are going to be constantly feeling like they're behind, and a subscription model starts to feel like some sort of a relief there. And HP's own structure kind of tells you what they're adjusting for. If you don't return the hardware, they can just charge you up to a few $1,000s, depending on the tier. And the whole system is designed around to keep you into some recurring payment loop. It's a business model that makes even more sense if the future is higher prices, tighter supply, and consumers getting squeezed out of the buy once and keep for years pattern. I can certainly see, other manufacturers getting on board with this as well, this type of business model, and to take advantage of consumers who, missed the train on building a rig or buying a pre-built system when RAM and storage were cheap. But this whole renting hardware future and then renting computers off of the cloud is something that I definitely don't want to be a part of. But taking all of that into consideration, we're seeing the same pattern. Storage and supply is getting sucked up by the mainstream. Consumer products are starting to see pricing just absolutely soar and start to get hit with stock issues. And then, companies roll out these solutions like subscriptions that really just turn your gaming setup, your hobby, into a monthly bill. And if you find yourself in a situation like this, look, I'm not saying you should be panic buying, but you should certainly be getting creative and, look at the used market, see what stores are selling for on clearance and try your luck there. And, if your current rig still runs fine, and you're content with the performance, then there's nothing wrong with keeping it. Go back and revisit some older classics, go back and look at emulators. There's tons of older media out there that you can consume. You don't necessarily have to keep riding the wave of the latest and greatest. But I do definitely want to hear your guys' thoughts on this as well. Where things are going to go from here. Is this just temporary, or is this going to be a permanent stance now where the general consumers are priority number 2, and the big enterprise giants are what will be gobbling up like 70, 80, 90% of the supply that's out there. But that's going to be wrapping it up for this one, so we'll touch base in the next video. Take care.
If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Be sure to check out the video description for cool links and ways to support the channel, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. And if you're interested in seeing more content like this, then consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.